I want to tell you something before we start. I'm not proud of everything I did. I'm not proud of the person I became in order to win. And I use the word win carefully because some nights I sit in my office, 43rd floor, floor-to-ceiling glass, the city spread out below me like something I conquered. And I wonder whether what I did qualifies as winning at all, or whether I just traded one kind of emptiness for another. But here's the thing. What they did to me was real. The humiliation was real. The poverty was real. The night I spent sitting on a concrete floor in a law school hallway, reading case law by the light coming in under a door because my electricity had been shut off. That was real. And if you've never had someone take something from you not because they needed it, but simply because they could, then maybe you won't understand why I did what I did. That's okay. I'm not here to be understood. I'm here to tell the truth. I grew up in a place that doesn't make the news. A small, flat town in eastern Ohio where the best job most people could get was at the distribution warehouse off Route 30, and where the word college was used the way other people use the word someday, aspirationally, distantly, without any real plan attached to it. My mother cleaned houses, not as a side job, as a career, if you can call it that. 5 days a week, sometimes 6, she drove her 1998 Civic with the cracked dashboard and the driver's side window that wouldn't roll all the way up to other people's houses, and she scrubbed their floors and washed their dishes and folded their children's clothes, and came home with hands that smelled like bleach and a tiredness that lived in her bones. She never complained about it, not once. That was the thing about my mother. She had decided that complaining was a form of weakness, and she had made a decision somewhere along the line not to be weak. So she didn't complain, she just worked, and she came home, and she made dinner, and she asked me what I was reading. She always asked me what I was reading. I was always reading something. That was the deal we had worked out with the universe, my mother and I. She would keep the lights on and the food in the refrigerator, and I would read everything I could get my hands on, and together we would produce something, some version of a future that was different from the present. That was the plan, not a written plan, not a 5-step strategy, just a mutual, unspoken understanding that what was happening now was not what was going to happen forever. I was 12 when I first understood what a lawyer was. Really understood it, I mean. Not just the television version where they shout objections in courtrooms, but the actual mechanics of what a lawyer does. My mother had a dispute with a landlord over a security deposit. $350. Doesn't sound like much, but $350 was 2 weeks of groceries for us, and the landlord knew that, and he kept it anyway because he could. Because my mother didn't know the law, and he did, or at least he knew enough of it to feel protected. She found a legal aid clinic eventually. A young woman there, barely out of law school herself, with a worn briefcase and ink stains on her fingers, wrote 2 letters. Just 2 letters. And the landlord sent back the $350 within a week. I watched my mother read that letter, confirming the deposit return 3 times. Twice to herself, once aloud. She didn't cry. She wasn't the kind of person who cried easily, but she folded that letter very carefully and put it in the kitchen drawer, where she kept important documents, and that night she made my favorite meal, pasta with tomato sauce and canned mushrooms, and we ate it together at the kitchen table, and she told me that knowledge was the one form of power that nobody could repossess. Knowledge was the one form of power that nobody could repossess. I wrote that in my notebook the next morning. I've carried it with me ever since, though not always in a form I recognized. I was a scholarship student at Alderton Law School, and I want to be clear about what that means. Not just the financial part of it, though the financial part was significant, but the sociological part. Alderton was, and still is, one of the 15 most prestigious law schools in the country. It sat on a hill in a mid-sized northeastern city, and its buildings were the kind of gray stone that communicated permanence and authority in a way that no amount of modern architecture could replicate. The library held over 500,000 volumes. The faculty included 3 former federal judges, 2 former solicitors general, and 1 person who had argued before the Supreme Court 11 times. The alumni network was a map of American power: senators, circuit court judges, managing partners at the firms that shaped corporate policy across entire industries. And I got there on a full merit scholarship, which paid tuition and provided a small monthly stipend for living expenses. Small is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The stipend was $900 a month. In a city where a single room in a shared house cost $700, that left $200 for food, transportation, clothing, books, and everything else. I know how to do math. I've always known how to do math. That's partly why I chose law, because in law, unlike in so many other things, the math eventually becomes obvious. I shopped at Goodwill, not occasionally, exclusively. I bought my suits there when I could find something close enough to fitting, and I had 1 pair of dress shoes that I resoled twice and polished every Sunday morning. I ate rice and beans and whatever was on sale at the discount grocery store 3 blocks from my apartment. I walked everywhere I could to save on transit fare. I kept a detailed budget in a small notebook, and I reviewed it every morning before I left for class, the way other people check the weather. None of this embarrassed me. I want to say that clearly. None of it embarrassed me, because I understood it as a temporary condition, as the price of admission to something larger. What I didn't understand, what nobody had thought to tell me, was that at Alderton, the temporary conditions you arrived with had a way of becoming permanent identities. The first week of orientation, I met Kyle Prescott. Kyle Prescott. I've thought about how to describe him fairly, and I keep running into the problem that fairness requires some generosity of perception. And every time I try to be generous about Kyle Prescott, my memory corrects me. He was handsome in the way that certain people are handsome when everything in their life has aligned to make them handsome. Good genetics, good nutrition from childhood, orthodontia, and personal training, and the confidence that comes from never having had to doubt whether you deserve to be in a room. His father was Judge William Prescott of the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, a man whose name appeared in the footnotes of major legal decisions the way certain other names appeared in encyclopedias. Kyle had grown up in Connecticut. He'd done his undergraduate degree at Yale. He drove a silver BMW that he parked in the lot behind the law school building every morning, and left there every evening when he went out to whatever restaurant or bar the people in his orbit were treating as the current destination. He had an orbit. That was the thing. Within the first 2 weeks of law school, Kyle Prescott had established a gravitational field around himself that included roughly a dozen other students. People who shared his background, his ease, his sense that Alderton was not a destination, but a waypoint on a predetermined route to somewhere obvious. Gregory Harper, whose family ran a regional bank. Harrison Grant, whose uncle was a senior partner at one of the biggest firms in New York. Paige Davenport, whose mother sat on the boards of 2 Fortune 500 companies. Nicole Adams, who had deferred from a position at a government agency to do the degree. They moved through Alderton as a unit, occupying the same tables in the library, the same seats in the lecture halls, the same corner booths at the faculty receptions. I was not in their orbit. I was, if anything, the gravitational negative, the presence that the system organized itself around avoiding. There was an economics to social belonging at Alderton that I began to understand very quickly, and that understanding was its own kind of education, not the legal education I'd come for, but an education in how elite institutions actually operate, versus how they present themselves as operating. The presentations, the open houses, the orientation speeches, the brochures, spoke constantly about meritocracy, about the best rising, about the process of selection that had brought all of us to this building, this program, this cohort, which was, by every official metric, the best cohort in years. What the presentations didn't mention was that meritocracy has prerequisites, that the ability to demonstrate merit requires access to the contexts where merit can be displayed, the receptions and the networking events and the faculty dinners and the informal gatherings where professional relationships actually form. And access to those contexts requires, in most cases, the kind of money that allows you to dress appropriately, to show up without having to work a second job that night, to participate in the reciprocal gestures of social capital exchange, picking up a round of drinks, sharing a cab, offering to host, that form the invisible currency of belonging. I had none of that currency, and the more I understood how the currency worked, the more clearly I understood that Kyle Prescott and his circle were not simply richer than me. They were operating in a different economic system, one in which the costs of participation were invisible to the participants, because they had never experienced a world in which those costs couldn't simply be absorbed. The first time Kyle Prescott spoke to me directly, we were in constitutional law, first semester, first year. I had answered a question about the Commerce Clause that the professor, a precise, demanding woman named Rachel Ellis, had noted with what I interpreted as real enthusiasm. She had said, "That's a sophisticated framing. Say more." And I had said more, and she had nodded, and I had felt, for approximately 4 minutes, like someone who belonged in that room. Then class ended, and Kyle Prescott appeared next to me in the aisle. "You know she has to call on the scholarship kids," he said, not quietly, not as an aside, just loudly, in a normal speaking voice, loud enough for the 5 or 6 people still gathering their things to hear. "It's a diversity thing. She's not actually impressed. She's just doing the quota." He said it without malice, which was the worst part. He said it with the breezy, confident certainty of someone explaining a fact of nature, the way you might explain to a child why the sky is blue, as though the very idea that a scholarship student could produce a thought worth genuine admiration was so self-evidently absurd that the only possible explanation was institutional obligation. I didn't say anything. I didn't have a response ready because I hadn't yet learned to expect that kind of attack. I was 23 years old, and I had grown up in a world where cruelty, when it happened, was usually straightforward, visible, classifiable, something you could categorize and respond to. What Kyle Prescott had just done was different. It was casual. It was bloodless. It was administered with the absolute confidence of someone who has never once been told that their perceptions of the world might be wrong. I gathered my books and walked out, and I told myself, very quietly and privately, that it didn't matter, that I was there to learn law, that what other people thought of me was not relevant to what I was doing or where I was going. I was right about all of that. I just hadn't understood yet how irrelevant being right can be when you're operating in a system that rewards the wrong things. Law school is a particular kind of social environment, and I think it's worth explaining this if you've never experienced it, because it shapes everything that came afterward. The Socratic method, the process by which professors call on students without warning and interrogate them about the cases, creates a specific kind of performative pressure. You are always potentially on stage. Every class is potentially your moment of public excellence or public failure, and everyone in the room is watching, and the professor's opinion of your answer becomes, in some real sense, the room's opinion of your worth. It's a system designed to produce good lawyers, people who can think on their feet under pressure, but it's also a system that is extraordinarily susceptible to manipulation by people who are good at managing perceptions. Kyle Prescott was very, very good at managing perceptions. He wasn't the smartest student in our class. I knew this by the end of the first semester, because I had read his work. His written memos were available in the Student Resource Center, shared as examples, and while his writing was polished, it was thin. He cited the expected cases. He made the expected arguments. He never reached for anything uncomfortable or surprising. His grades were excellent, but they were excellent in the way that excellent grades from excellent people often are. They reflected mastery of the expected rather than capacity for the unexpected. But he understood something that I didn't understand yet, which was that in the world he was operating in, the world of large law firms and judicial clerkships and the partnerships that emerged from both, the appearance of brilliance was often more useful than brilliance itself, because the people making the decisions were often too busy to evaluate the work closely, and so they evaluated the person instead. He built his reputation carefully. He was articulate in class. He hosted study sessions at his apartment, and I heard about these study sessions secondhand, because of course I was never invited. And he made sure that the right people attended. He cultivated relationships with the right professors. He positioned himself, in other words, as the obvious choice for everything: the journal, the moot court, the prestigious research assistant positions. And because he had built his reputation with the people who made those choices, the choices tended to confirm his reputation. I was on the opposite side of this equation. I was the student who answered questions well in class, but whose answers were attributed, by Kyle and his allies, to some form of statistical anomaly or institutional charity. I was the student who showed up to events in Goodwill suits, which were always slightly wrong, the lapels too wide, the sleeves a half-inch too short, the colors that shade off from appropriate that you only notice if you've spent a lot of time around appropriate. I was the student who couldn't attend the dinners and the receptions and the networking events that had a cover charge or required a ticket because the math didn't work. I was invisible in the ways that matter most. The thing about being poor in an expensive institution is that it's a compounding condition. You can't go to the alumni mixer because you can't afford the dress code. And because you can't go to the alumni mixer, you don't make the contacts. And because you don't make the contacts, you don't get the research assistant position. And because you don't get the research assistant position, your resume looks thin. And when you apply for the clerkship that would open the next door, you look less qualified than the person who went to the mixer and made the contact and got the position, even if your work is better. I felt this compounding most sharply at the end of my first year, during the summer clerkship scramble. The summer position at a major firm was, for law students, the gold standard. It was essentially an extended job interview. It paid well. It provided the firm connections that could define a career, and the students who got it emerged from the summer with a confidence that was visible and real. I applied to 14 firms. I received 2 interviews. The first went well enough that I was invited to a lunch with the associate committee. A lunch at a restaurant that, I calculated, charged $40 for an entree, and where everyone ordered freely because the firm was paying, and where the conversation ranged over topics that required the kind of cultural referencing, travel, particular schools, mutual connections, that I simply could not participate in. Not because I had nothing to say, but because the specific vocabulary of their world was not my vocabulary, and the gap was visible. I received a polite decline by email 4 days later. The second interview went differently. It was a smaller firm, not one of the major names, but a respected boutique, and the interviewing partner was a woman named Allison Keller, who had, I learned later, grown up in a working-class family in rural Pennsylvania, and who put approximately 0 weight on the vocabulary of elite belonging. She asked me about my analysis of a recent circuit court decision during the interview, and we spent 40 minutes talking about it, and at the end she shook my hand and said, "You think clearly. We'll be in touch." They offered me a position. The pay was lower than the major firms. I took it immediately, and I spent that summer learning more about actual legal practice than I had in 2 full semesters of coursework, and Allison Keller taught me things about how to assess a case that I used for the next 15 years. I understood this as a gift, but I also understood, and this is important, that it was a gift that Kyle Prescott had not needed to receive, because he had never been excluded from the right rooms to begin with. He had not needed someone to see past the vocabulary gap, because there was no gap. The network was his to use from birth, and every advantage he gained from it was an advantage he thought of as simply the natural order of things. The thing about being poor in an expensive institution is that it's a compounding condition. I understood this. What I didn't understand yet, and this is the thing I regret most looking back, is how systematically Kyle Prescott was making it worse. It started with small things, a word here, a comment there. Kyle had developed a talent, and I do mean talent because it required a particular kind of social intelligence, for deploying what I would later come to call credibility poisoning. He would say things about you to the right people in a tone that suggested not hostility but concern. He would express doubt about your capabilities in the form of questions. I wonder if he's keeping up with the reading load. He would raise uncertainties about your background. His undergraduate program was small. Do you think he's had exposure to this kind of analytical framework? He would position himself as someone who wanted you to succeed, while simultaneously ensuring that the people around him understood you were at risk of not succeeding. It was brilliant. I didn't recognize it for what it was until my second year, and by then it had been operating for 18 months. The first time I understood what was happening, I was standing outside Professor Ellis's office, waiting for office hours, and I overheard two students talking in the hallway. They didn't know I was there. One of them, I recognized his voice as Harrison Grant's, was saying something about the law review selection process, and I heard my name, and then I heard, yeah, but Kyle said his writing sample was basically unoriginal, like derivative of the scholarship he cited rather than building on it. And the other voice said, really? He seems smart in class? And Harrison said, I know, that's what I thought. But Kyle actually read the piece, apparently, said it just didn't add anything new. Kyle had not read my writing sample. I knew this because my writing sample had not been shared with students. It had been submitted directly to the selection committee through the official process. But Kyle had told people he'd read it, and he had told them it was inadequate, and Harrison Grant believed him. And now Harrison Grant was on the selection committee. I didn't make law review that year. The incident that I think about most, the one that I've replayed the most often in the years since, happened in the middle of my second year in the spring. There was a moot court competition. It was the kind of thing that looks significant on a resume, a regional competition with judges drawn from actual federal courts, observed by partners from several major firms. The first-year team had made it to the semifinal round, and one of the members had sprained his ankle badly enough that he couldn't travel. They needed a replacement, and Professor Ellis, who coached the team and who had, I believe, developed something like genuine respect for my analytical work, recommended me. I prepared for 3 weeks. I mean that literally. I reorganized my entire schedule around the preparation. I read every case relevant to the questions presented. I developed arguments and counter-arguments and counter-counter-arguments. I stood in my bathroom and practiced my oral presentation at my reflection until the reflection stopped looking nervous. I called my mother on a Sunday and told her about it. And she was quiet for a moment and then said, "You know your subject. Trust your subject." And I said, "Yes," and meant it. The night before we were supposed to travel to Philadelphia, where the competition was being held, I received an email from the competition registrar. There was a problem with my registration. My student status had been flagged. Apparently, a question had been raised about whether I was in good academic standing, which was required for competition eligibility. I was in perfect academic standing. I had a 3.84 GPA. I had not had a single academic irregularity of any kind. I spent that night on the phone with the registrar's office, with the law school's academic records office, with the competition administrator. By the time the question was resolved, and it was resolved eventually in my favor, it was 3 a.m, and the team had left for Philadelphia without me. They had to compete with their original 5 members, which meant someone competed with a sprained ankle. They lost in the semifinal. I never found out officially who had raised the flag about my academic standing. I had suspicions. I had very specific suspicions, but suspicions are not evidence, and I had been studying law long enough to understand the difference. What I did know was this: someone had access to the competition registration system, and someone had thought to use it, and the timing was not a coincidence. I sat in my apartment that night after the calls were done, and I felt something shift in me. I'm not sure I have a good word for it. It wasn't anger exactly. Anger is hot and disorganized. This was cold and very precise. It was the feeling of understanding for the first time that the game I was playing had different rules for different players, and that being right and being qualified and being prepared were not sufficient because the game itself was rigged. I made a decision. I didn't make it. Dramatically. There was no moment of resolve, no clenched fist, no vow spoken aloud. I just decided, sitting there at my kitchen table at 3 a.m, with my legal pads spread out around me, that I was going to be more patient than they expected me to be, and more observant and more quiet. I was going to stop fighting the game they were playing and start learning everything I could about the players. By the time my 3rd year began, I'd learned to navigate Alderton in a particular way. I was not invisible anymore. I had developed too strong an academic record for that. But I had learned to be strategically unremarkable in social situations. I attended the events I was supposed to attend. I said the things I was supposed to say. I did not give Kyle Prescott or Gregory Harper or Harrison Grant any new material. What I did, outside of class, was this. I listened. This sounds passive. It isn't passive. Listening, really listening, the kind of listening that involves attention and memory and pattern recognition, is one of the most active things a person can do. And in a law school building, where people talk about their work and their connections and their plans with the particular unguarded confidence of people who don't expect anyone outside their circle to be paying attention, there was a great deal to hear. I heard about deals, not the legal kind, the social kind, the arrangements that governed who got what, which professors were connected to which firms were willing to do what for the right introduction, which students were being positioned for which opportunities and by whom. And I heard things that were, by any reasonable standard, problematic. A conversation about a professor whose research data was being massaged to produce desired conclusions. A discussion of how a particular firm had structured an arrangement with a judicial chamber that would, in ordinary circumstances, require disclosure. A late-night exchange about how a particular student had managed to submit work that was not entirely their own. I wrote it all down. In a notebook I kept in my apartment, in a shorthand I developed for the purpose, indexed by date and participant. I wasn't sure why I was doing it at first. Or rather, I was sure in an instinctive way that I couldn't yet articulate. I understood that information was a form of currency, that the people around me were spending currency I didn't have, and that if I was patient and attentive, I might accumulate a currency of my own. Then came the scholarship. The final semester of law school is not when you expect everything to collapse. The final semester is when you're supposed to be completing the application process, confirming your bar exam registration, finishing the last of your classes with the confidence of someone who has made it through the hardest part. You are close enough to the end that the end feels inevitable. I received the letter on a Tuesday in February. It was on Alderton letterhead from the Dean of Student Affairs. The scholarship committee, the letter informed me, had conducted a review of all merit scholarships in light of new information regarding academic conduct. Following this review, my scholarship was being revoked, effective immediately, due to a finding of academic dishonesty in my second-year legal writing seminar. I read the letter twice. Then I set it down on my kitchen table and I sat very still for what might have been 10 minutes. Academic dishonesty in my second-year legal writing seminar, a seminar I had completed 18 months earlier, in which I had received an A, in which I had submitted work that was entirely my own, sourced from primary materials that I had cited correctly and completely. I appealed immediately. I filed a formal response to the scholarship committee within 48 hours. I provided copies of all my submitted work. I provided a detailed accounting of my research process, my sources, my drafts. I requested a hearing. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Those 6 weeks were the most financially devastating of my life. Without the scholarship, I had no money for tuition, and tuition for a semester at Alderton was substantial, more than I had ever held in my hands at any point in my life. The stipend stopped immediately. I could not pay rent. I called my mother, and she cried quietly on the phone, which she never did, and offered to send me what she had saved, which was $412, and I said no, absolutely not, and meant it, and then spent the rest of the night figuring out how to survive without that money. The hearing, when it finally came, was conclusory in the worst possible way. The committee had received a complaint from another student. They would not tell me who, citing confidentiality, alleging that a section of my legal writing submission had reproduced arguments from an unpublished manuscript that the other student had shared with me in confidence. The committee had reviewed both documents and found sufficient similarity to constitute a finding of dishonesty. I asked to see the comparison. They showed me 2 documents side by side. The first was my submission. The second was what they claimed was the prior manuscript. Here is what I understood immediately, because I knew my own work. The second document was a fabrication, not a fabrication of the whole thing. That would have been too obvious, but a fabrication of specific sections that contained arguments similar to mine, because they had been constructed to mirror mine. Someone had taken my submitted work, identified the most original analytical sections, and reverse-engineered a prior document that appeared to have been written first. This was sophisticated. It was the kind of thing that required both technical skill in creating convincing document metadata and institutional access, in submitting the fabricated document through channels that gave it the appearance of legitimacy. I said all of this to the committee. They listened politely. They denied the appeal. I was still enrolled. I had not been expelled. But without the scholarship, I couldn't pay. And without paying, I couldn't complete my degree. I had 1 semester left. 1 semester, and I would have a law degree from Alderton, and everything my mother and I had worked toward would be real and solid and mine. Without the scholarship, I had nothing. I went to the financial aid office, then to the bursar, then to the dean's office. I applied for emergency funding. I applied for a tuition loan. I applied for every form of assistance the institution offered. I was denied most of them, and the ones I wasn't denied couldn't come close to covering the shortfall. I ran out of options in April. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you about the mistake I made, because I said at the beginning that I would be honest, and this is the part that requires the most honesty. When the appeal was denied and the scholarship was gone, and the financial options were exhausted, I almost did something that would have destroyed everything. Not anything violent, that was never on the table, but something reckless, something born of the specific white-hot quality of the injustice, which was not just that something had been taken from me, but that it had been taken from me through a mechanism that was designed to look like a legitimate process. The machinery of institutional justice had been used against me, and the most maddening thing about it was that I couldn't point clearly at any one person and say, "This is what they did." The machinery covered the trail. I drafted a letter. I spent 3 nights writing it, a comprehensive document laying out everything I believed had happened, with every piece of evidence I had, addressed to the dean, the provost, the board of trustees, the State Bar Association, and 2 journalists who covered legal education. I was 26 years old, and I was furious, and I believed completely that if I showed people what had happened, the system would respond. I had the envelope ready to mail when my mother called. Not because she knew about the letter. She didn't. She called because it was a Thursday, and we talked on Thursdays. She asked how I was doing. I told her I was managing. She told me about a problem with the car, the Civic, still running, still with the cracked dashboard. And we talked about it for 20 minutes, the practical specifics of what was wrong with the car, and how much it would cost, and whether it was worth fixing or worth finding something different. I didn't mail the letter. Not because of anything she said. She didn't say anything that touched the situation, but because listening to her voice, the practical, specific quality of her engagement with the real problem in front of her, which was the car, not the injustice, because the car was the thing that needed to be solved today. I heard something I'd been drowning out with my own anger. I heard, "This is what you do. You solve the problem in front of you. You don't waste the energy you have on the problem you can't solve yet." If I had mailed that letter, Kyle Prescott's lawyers would have been in my life within a week. Not because he was guilty, he was, but that's not the relevant point, but because he had the resources to make a nuisance claim against a person with nothing into a career-ending experience, and I had nothing to defend myself with. The letter would have given him a target. It would have turned my specific, evidence knowledge into an actionable complaint that he could have buried under counter-allegations, legal costs, and the institutional credibility that his name and his father's name provided. I burned the letter in the sink in my kitchen. I watched it go, and I felt something I would not have expected to feel in that moment, which was relief. I had been given a piece of information about myself. I was capable of learning from near mistakes, and I had been given also a piece of information about the situation. The right move was not the immediate move. The right move was the one that I could make from a position of actual strength, not reactive fury. That understanding took 15 years to pay off, but it paid off. What saved me, if you can call it saving, was a conversation with Daniel Foster. Daniel ran the facilities department at Alderton's main building. He was a quiet man, mid-50s, who had worked there for over 20 years and who moved through the building with the particular authority of someone who understood how everything actually functioned, as opposed to how it was supposed to function. We had exchanged nods in passing for 3 years. He knew I was a student. I knew he was the person who made sure the building worked. In the second week of April, I was sitting in one of the building's side stairwells at 11 at night. A stairwell I'd discovered was reliably empty and warm, trying to figure out the math of my situation, and Daniel came through to check a utility panel. He saw me. He didn't say anything immediately. He checked the panel, made a note, and then turned around. "Building's got a late-night cleaning crew," he said. "We lost 2 positions last week. If you want, it's yours. It doesn't pay much, but it's more than nothing." It paid $14 an hour. The shift was 11 at night to 6 in the morning, 3 nights a week. Not enough to cover tuition, enough to cover food, enough to cover the floor of a room I rented from a woman who lived 4 miles from campus and who charged $300 a month, because the room was technically a converted storage area with no window. I took the job, and I finished my degree. This is the part of the story people find hard to believe, or find inspirational in a cheap way, as though the point is the persistence. The persistence is not the point. The point is what happened during those shifts. When you clean an office building at midnight, You are invisible in a way that is different from social invisibility. You are functionally not there. People leave things behind. Not just physical things, though those too, but conversations, papers, screens left open, audio playing from a laptop someone forgot to close. And sometimes, and this happened more than you would expect, people held conversations in their offices or in the hallways that they conducted at full volume, because they had no framework in which to consider that the person emptying the trash cans was paying attention. I was paying attention. I had 3 years of law school training in how to listen to information and what to do with it. I had a notebook. I had a memory that I had spent years deliberately sharpening, and I had a motive that was clarifying itself, night by night, into something patient and very precise. The 3rd week of my first month cleaning, I was in the faculty wing, a section of the building that contained the private offices of senior faculty and that most cleaning staff treated as a quick pass-through, because the offices were usually empty and there wasn't much to do. I was in the hallway, and the door to one of the senior faculty offices was cracked, and I could hear 2 voices clearly. One of the voices belonged to Professor Harrison, not to be confused with Harrison Grant the student, a senior tax law professor who was known to have extensive private practice connections. The other voice I recognized after a moment as Kyle Prescott's. They were talking about a case. Specifically, they were talking about a piece of testimony that had been provided in a pending matter involving a real estate development corporation. The testimony in question had apparently been prepared, not just supported, but actually prepared, by Professor Harrison in collaboration with Kyle's father, Judge Prescott. The problem was that Judge Prescott was currently sitting on the circuit court that would be hearing an appeal in a related case, which meant that the judge's involvement in preparing favorable testimony for one of the parties in the underlying matter, while his court was positioned to hear an appeal, that was not a minor ethical complication, that was significant. I stood in the hallway for 4 minutes without moving. Then I went back to my cart, found my notebook, and wrote down everything I had heard, verbatim, with timestamps and a note about the office location. This is the entry in my notebook. I still have it, dated April 14th. Over the next 7 weeks, I filled 14 pages. I heard about academic misconduct, not mine, real misconduct, conducted by students who had the social capital to make it work. Gregory Harper had submitted a brief in constitutional law that had been substantially written by a 3rd-year student at a different school in exchange for a cash payment that Gregory had documented inadvisably in his email. I found the email chain open on his screen one night when I was cleaning his study carrel. I photographed it with my phone. I heard about political influence. Kyle's father's name came up again and again, in conversations, in documents, in the invisible architecture of favors and arrangements that governed who got what at Alderton, and in the professional world beyond it. Judge Prescott was generous with his influence. He made calls, he wrote letters, he opened doors that should have stayed closed, and the people who benefited from these arrangements were careful and polite, and almost never explicit about what they were receiving and what they owed. I heard about the scholarship review. This is the one that broke something open inside me, because it confirmed what I had suspected but couldn't prove. I was in the administrative corridor, a hallway that connected the student affairs offices, on a Thursday night in May, and 2 members of the scholarship committee were working late. Their voices carried through the door. I heard my name. I heard the phrase, Prescott situation. I heard one of them say, "The documentation was submitted through proper channels, though." And the other said, "Yes, but it would be naive to ignore the context in which it was submitted." And then there was a pause, and the first voice said, "It's done now anyway. It's done now anyway." I stood outside that door, holding a mop, and I understood completely and finally what had happened to me. Kyle Prescott had manufactured evidence of my academic dishonesty. He had submitted it through channels that gave it the appearance of legitimacy. He had done it because I was a threat. Not a social threat, not a personal threat, but a professional threat. Because in the narrow world of elite law, the number of positions available at the top is finite, and every credential I earned was a credential he wanted, and I was good enough to compete. He hadn't ruined my scholarship out of malice. He had ruined it out of calculation. That was, somehow, worse. I graduated from Alderton in June, in a ceremony I attended in a borrowed gown, with my mother sitting in the 4th row of the visitors section in her best dress, which was navy blue with small white buttons. She had driven 6 hours to be there. She cried when they called my name. I walked across the stage and accepted the degree from the dean's hand, and I looked out at the audience, and I found my mother's face, and I smiled. I did not look for Kyle Prescott. I didn't need to see his reaction. I knew, from the social architecture of Alderton, exactly where he was headed. He had a position confirmed at one of the largest firms in the country, a firm with offices in 12 cities, over 300 partners, and a client list that included several Fortune 50 corporations. He was going there as an associate, and everyone knew he would be partner within 8 years because of who his father was, and that would be the beginning of the next chapter of his ascent. I was going somewhere very different. I passed the bar examination on my first attempt. I know that sounds like I'm bragging. I'm not. I'm telling you because it matters to what comes next. I passed the bar on my first attempt and received a score in the 91st percentile. And the people who might have done something with that information, the firms, the clerkship offices, the institutions that distribute opportunity, never knew, because I had no one to tell them. I applied to 47 positions in the year after graduation. I received interviews at 6. I received offers from 2. The offers were at firms you've never heard of, in cities that do not make the list of places where the significant work happens, paying salaries that were, after student loan repayment, not very different from what I had earned cleaning offices. I took one of the offers. It was at a small litigation firm in a mid-sized Midwestern city, a firm of 11 attorneys, none of them Alderton graduates, none of them with connections to the world I had just left. They specialized in insurance defense work. I spent my days defending insurance companies against injury claims, drafting motions in routine matters, attending depositions for cases that would never go to trial. It was not what I had imagined. Here is the thing about the kind of law I was doing, though. It was, in its own way, a comprehensive education. Insurance defense is unglamorous, but it is technically demanding in ways that the glamorous work often isn't. I read hundreds of depositions. I saw how people behaved when they were telling the truth and how they behaved when they weren't. I developed an almost instinctive ability to spot the moment when a narrative became inconsistent with the documents, and I learned how to use that inconsistency with precision and patience. I became, over 5 years of grinding through cases that nobody else wanted, an exceptionally good litigator. I also became someone who understood how money moved. Insurance defense means you work with insurance companies. Insurance companies are, fundamentally, financial entities. They are in the business of assessing risk and pricing it and managing it. And the people who run them are people who think in terms of capital allocation. Working on their cases meant reading their financial documents, understanding their balance sheets, seeing how they structured their exposure. It was an education in finance that I hadn't expected and hadn't sought, but that turned out to be extremely valuable. I started reading financial filings outside of work, not the popular financial press, the actual filings. 10Ks, proxy statements, offering documents. I started to understand how companies were structured, how value was created and extracted, how the people who controlled institutions made their decisions and what they were looking for. And I started saving money. Saving money when you don't make much money is an act of almost violent discipline. I'm not going to make it sound romantic. It wasn't romantic. I ate the same things, in the same apartment, wearing the same clothes for years. I did not go on vacations. I did not buy furniture that was new. I did not drink, which was an unusual choice in a professional culture that operated substantially through after-work drinks, and which cost me socially in ways I understood and accepted. I put every dollar I could into an index fund, a simple, low-cost, diversified fund, and I left it there. And I did not look at it more than once a month. By year 3, I had $40,000 saved. By year 5, I had $97,000. And by year 5, I had also developed a second skill, which I had not planned to develop, but which emerged from the specific nature of my practice. I had become extraordinarily good at understanding distress situations, companies, assets, individuals who were in financial difficulty and needed solutions. The insurance defense work, counterintuitively, had given me extensive exposure to situations where things had gone wrong, and I had developed an instinct for the architecture of failure, how it accumulated, where the leverage points were, what a resolution actually required. I started consulting on the side, small businesses mostly, family-owned companies that had gotten into financial difficulty and needed someone who understood both the legal and financial dimensions of their situation. I charged modest rates because I was still building a reputation. I worked evenings and weekends. I solved problems. Word got around in the way that word gets around in tight commercial communities, that there was someone who could untangle complicated situations and who didn't overbill. In year 6, I left the insurance defense firm, but before I left, something happened that I want to describe carefully, because it shaped the way I thought about the next chapter in ways that the simple professional narrative doesn't capture. There was a case in my 5th year that involved a small restaurant, a family business, run by a couple who had immigrated from Eastern Europe 22 years earlier, and who had built the restaurant from nothing into something that sustained their family, and employed 11 people from the neighborhood. They had been sued by a slip-and-fall claimant, a woman who had, according to the surveillance footage I reviewed, staged the incident with surprising thoroughness. The insurance company's initial instinct was to settle because settling was cheaper than litigating, even in cases with strong defenses. I argued against settlement. I wrote the memo. I laid out the evidence. I explained why the right outcome here was to fight. My supervisor at the time, a senior attorney named Isaac Lawson, who had spent 20 years in insurance defense and whose instinct for the practical was usually impeccable, read my memo and said, "You're probably right, but you understand that being right costs money." I said, "Yes, but setting this precedent costs more." He thought about it for 3 days. He came back and said we'd fight it. We won. The claimant's attorney, facing evidence he hadn't expected, withdrew the claim in the 4th week of discovery. The restaurant owners sent a card to the firm, a handwritten card with a photograph of their restaurant on the front. And when it was passed around the office, nobody really knew what to do with it, because the culture of insurance defense doesn't have a framework for gratitude. I kept the card. I still have it somewhere. What I understood from that case was something about what I wanted to do with my career. Not insurance defense, not the representation of institutions against individuals, but the identification of asymmetry, situations where someone or something had been wrongly positioned, where the application of the right legal and financial tools could correct the positioning. That was what I wanted to do. That was the skill I had, and it was the skill that the insurance defense work had given me, and I was grateful for it even as I was leaving. I left quietly. I thanked everyone. I left a gift, a case of wine, for the woman who had been the firm's office manager for 15 years and who had taught me, early on, how to read a financial statement quickly. I walked out of that building on a Friday afternoon with a reference letter, a client list that I had earned through my consulting practice, and a plan. The plan was not revenge. I want to be clear about that. The plan at that point was a law practice of my own, a boutique firm focused on distressed assets and complex litigation, the two areas where I had developed real expertise. Revenge was not in the plan because revenge requires a fixed target, and I had been too busy building to keep Kyle Prescott in my sights. What I had instead was the notebook. The firm started in a 2-room office above a dry cleaner in a neighborhood that had been described to me by my commercial real estate broker, a pragmatic woman named Lauren Mitchell who had grown up poor and who did not waste words, as transitional, which meant it was cheap and it was mine. I called the firm Caldwell Group, not because of any particular attachment to the name. It was a name from my notebook, the name of a client I had helped early on, but because it sounded established and neutral and revealed nothing about who I was or where I had come from. Anonymity was a tool. I understood that now. The early years of the firm are not a story of sudden success. They are a story of patient competence. I took the cases nobody else wanted: distressed commercial real estate, failed business partnerships with complicated histories, insurance coverage disputes with buried factual issues. I was not building a brand exactly. I was building a track record, and I was building it in areas where having a deep understanding of both law and finance gave me an advantage over lawyers who were only lawyers or financiers who were only financiers. I hired carefully. My first hire was a financial analyst, a young man named Matthew Turner, who had washed out of investment banking because he was terrible at the performance aspects of the job, but extraordinary at the technical analysis. He could look at a set of financial statements and find things that other analysts missed. He was also direct to the point of social difficulty, which meant he told me the truth without managing my reactions, which was exactly what I needed. My second hire was a paralegal. My third was another attorney, a young woman named Fiona Grant, who had gone to a state law school and passed the bar on her first attempt and was working at a firm where she was being systematically undervalued. I paid them all well. I paid them the salary I wish someone had paid me when I was starting out. And in return, I expected the standard I would have given. The work expanded, slowly, then less slowly. By year 4 of the firm, we had 8 attorneys and 12 support staff, and we had moved out of the office above the dry cleaner into a proper suite in a mid-rise building with a view of the river. We had clients in 3 states. We had a reputation in the specific world of complex commercial disputes and distressed asset resolution as a firm that could find the solution when other firms had given up. I want to describe what those middle years actually felt like, because this kind of story usually skips over the middle, jumps from the starting point to the result, and the middle is where the actual substance lives. The middle years were characterized by a quality I can only describe as compression, not unpleasant, more like the feeling of pushing against serious resistance and discovering that you are stronger than you thought. But that discovery is itself exhausting in a way that success alone doesn't quite capture. Every matter we handled was complicated. There were no easy wins. The clients who came to Caldwell Group came because no one else had been able to solve their problem, which meant that every client was a test of whether what I claimed to be able to do was actually something I could do. And those tests ran consecutively, without pause, for years. There were matters we lost. I need to say that clearly, because the narrative of someone who builds something from nothing has a tendency to retrospectively simplify into a series of successes, and that isn't what happened. We lost matters. We misjudged risk profiles. We took on clients whose situations were less recoverable than our analysis suggested, and we put in enormous effort and produced outcomes that were adequate rather than excellent. I did not handle every one of those situations with grace. There were nights in that first decade when I sat in the office above the dry cleaner, and later in the mid-rise, in an office that was better but still basically mine alone in the evenings, and went through the financials or the case files or the client communications and thought, I have made the wrong call. Not about the grand strategy, about this specific thing in this specific matter for this specific client. The ability to sit with that recognition and not either deny it or be destroyed by it is, I think, one of the things the insurance defense years gave me. You see so many cases, hundreds over 5 years, that you stop having an emotional investment in the individual outcome and start developing a statistical relationship to being right and being wrong. You learn that being right most of the time, with a clear understanding of why you were right, is more valuable than being right all of the time with no understanding of your own process. Because if you don't understand your process, you can't improve it. And if you can't improve it, the times you're wrong are just bad luck rather than information. I improve my process constantly. Matthew helped me. Fiona helped me. The clients, counterintuitively, helped me. The ones who told me clearly when I hadn't understood their situation correctly, who gave me the specific feedback that allowed the next engagement to be better calibrated. By year 8, the process was something I trusted. We also had money. Real money by this point. Not my personal savings, but the firm's accumulated capital, which had grown through a combination of high-stakes fee arrangements in matters where we performed, and an investment strategy that Matthew had developed and that had outperformed benchmarks consistently over 4 years. And I had started to use that money in a way that I had not explicitly planned, but that had been, in retrospect, building since the night I heard Kyle Prescott's name mentioned in a late-night conversation in a law school hallway. I had started buying things. The first acquisition was a small commercial property portfolio, 6 buildings in a mid-sized northeastern city, that had gone into receivership when its original owner defaulted on a set of loans structured in a way that left minimal equity for recovery. The portfolio included one building that I recognized from its address. It was within 4 blocks of Alderton Law School. I didn't buy the portfolio because of that building. I bought it because it was undervalued and I understood its value, and because I could see a clear path to restructuring the debt and improving the cash flow. Matthew and I spent 3 weeks building the analysis. We made an offer through a shell entity, a practice that was standard in distressed asset deals, because sellers preferred to deal with entities that had consistent presentation rather than individual purchasers, whose motivations might be unclear. The deal closed in October of year 7. We were profitable on the portfolio within 18 months. The second acquisition was a stake in a regional bank that was being restructured following an enforcement action by the federal banking regulator. The bank's distress had created a forced sale of certain assets, and one of those assets was a position in a lending portfolio that included real estate and commercial loans in several markets I understood well. The bank stake was more complicated. It required regulatory approval, which required disclosure of our ultimate ownership, which for the first time required me to be visible. I worked with a securities attorney, a precise, careful man named Benjamin Caldwell, whose name I had borrowed without his knowledge for my firm, to structure the disclosure correctly. My name appeared for the first time in a financial filing as a principal of an entity with significant commercial assets. Nobody noticed, which was fine. The point was not yet to be noticed. The point was to build. In years 8 through 11, we made 14 additional acquisitions, commercial real estate, distressed business loans, a minority stake in a regional infrastructure project, a position in a company that held significant patent assets in a niche technology area. Each acquisition was analyzed with the same rigor: Matthew's financial modeling, my legal assessment, a combined evaluation of the risk-adjusted return. By year 12, the portfolio was significant. I will not give you a number, because numbers invite a kind of attention I still find uncomfortable. I will tell you that it was significant in the way that changes what you can do next. Not impressive at a cocktail party significant, but structurally significant. The kind of significant that means your entities have credit lines that other entities want to work with, and that the financial institutions who track these things have started paying attention. And by year 12, I had started to hear things about Kyle Prescott again. The financial world is smaller than it appears from the outside. The number of people who are positioned to do significant transactions, to buy or sell companies, to structure complex debt arrangements, to participate in deals above a certain threshold, is not infinite, and the law world is even smaller. And the intersection of the two, which is where I had been operating for years and where Kyle Prescott, through his firm's corporate practice, was also operating, that intersection is very small indeed. I started hearing his name in deal discussions around year 10. Not in rooms I was in rooms adjacent to rooms I was in the way that names circulate in a community. Kyle Prescott was a partner at the firm, where he'd started as an associate. He had made partner in 7 years, faster than the standard track. Because his father had delivered 3 major clients to the firm, and because his father's reputation in the judicial world had given the firm a certain kind of credibility in matters where judicial relationships mattered, he was, by every visible measure, exactly what he had been positioned to become. He was 40 years old, a partner at a major firm with a home in Connecticut, not far from where he'd grown up, and a family, a wife named Megan and 2 daughters, and a professional reputation that was solid, if not spectacular. He was not the most brilliant transactional lawyer of his generation. He was the most reliably connected. The difference between those 2 things had been enough to build an excellent career. What I also started hearing, from year 11 onward, was a different story, a quieter story, told in the cautious language that professionals use when they're discussing something that hasn't become public yet. Kyle's father, Judge Prescott, had retired from the circuit court in year 10 of my firm's existence. This was itself unremarkable. He had reached the standard retirement age. What was less unremarkable was a pattern that was becoming visible in hindsight. Over a period of years, the arrangements that Judge Prescott had made, the calls, the letters, the invisible infrastructure of favors, had created a set of relationships that were now, in some cases, creating problems. A judicial conduct complaint had been filed, quietly, by a legal ethics organization. Certain financial relationships were being examined. Nothing public, nothing adjudicated, but a gathering of attention that people in the know were tracking with concern. And Kyle's firm was navigating this carefully, because several of the relationships under examination had involved the firm's clients during the period when Judge Prescott was still on the bench. I read these signals carefully. I had spent 15 years learning to read these signals, and I began, very deliberately, to position myself, the firm at the center of. Everything was called Mitchell, Grant, and Harper. It was one of the oldest and most prestigious law firms in the country. 320 partners, offices in 12 cities, revenues that placed it in the top 10 nationally. And Kyle Prescott was one of its partners, and Gregory Harper was one of its partners, and Harrison Grant was one of its partners, because of course they were. Mitchell, Grant, and Harper had, in the previous 3 years, experienced a set of departures and financial pressures that had reduced its partnership equity and created what the legal press was delicately calling succession uncertainty. 3 senior partners had retired. 2 significant client relationships had moved to competing firms. The firm's real estate practice, which had been a major revenue source, had contracted significantly as its primary client base shifted its needs. The firm was not failing. It was, however, in a condition of structural vulnerability that I recognized immediately, because I had spent 15 years learning to recognize exactly this condition. What a firm in this condition needs is capital. Capital to retain talent, to upgrade infrastructure, to fund the business development necessary to replace lost clients. And what a firm in this condition often cannot find, through traditional banking relationships, which have become more restrictive, is capital that comes without complicated strings attached, except from the kind of entity that specializes in exactly this situation. I had Matthew model it 3 times, from 3 different angles. The analysis was consistent every time. A significant investment in Mitchell, Grant, and Harper, structured as a convertible arrangement that would give my entities controlling interest upon certain triggers, was financially sound at the right price. The firm's underlying assets, its client relationships, its attorney talent, its physical infrastructure, were worth more than its current equity implied. But there was something else, something that wasn't in the financial model, that I kept out of the financial model deliberately because it needed to stay clean. I had the notebook, not just the notebook from law school. I had kept it current. Over 15 years, I had maintained a careful record of everything relevant I had learned about the people who had shaped my trajectory. Some of it was old information that had since become innocuous. Some of it was information that had never stopped being significant. The conversation I had overheard about Judge Prescott and the testimony, Gregory Harper's email chain about the purchased brief, the conversation outside the scholarship committee office, and, from more recent sources, financial filings, public records, things that were available to anyone who knew where to look and had the patience to look carefully, a picture of arrangements that, examined together, told a story that certain people would prefer not to have told. I did not plan to use the notebook as a weapon. I planned to use it as insurance. The distinction matters to me even now. I was not blackmailing anyone. I was ensuring that the terms of the engagement were clearly understood by all parties. In November of year 14, I called Mitchell, Grant, and Harper's managing partner. The managing partner's name was Preston Ellis, no relation to Professor Rachel Ellis, though I had often noted the coincidence of the shared surname. Preston Ellis was 62 years old, deeply practical, and not associated with any of the events of my law school years, which was one of the reasons I called him rather than anyone else. He was the kind of person who had built his career on solving problems rather than creating them, and what he had in front of him was a very significant problem. We met in his office. Not at Alderton, not at any place with history for me. A conference room in a neutral hotel in Midtown Manhattan. I came with Matthew. They came with Preston and 2 of their senior financial advisors. I had thought carefully about what I would wear to that meeting, not in a superficial way, in a considered way, the way I thought about everything. I wore a suit I had bought 2 years earlier from a tailor in Chicago, dark charcoal, properly fitted, not expensive enough to signal insecurity about money and not cheap enough to signal anything else. I wore good shoes. I carried a briefcase that was neither new nor old. I looked, as I intended to look, like someone who was entirely comfortable being exactly where he was. Preston Ellis was professional and careful. He had done his research on the Caldwell Group, or rather on the entities that publicly disclosed their relationship to it, and he had found a picture of a financially serious organization with a strong track record in complex transactions. He had not found my name, because my name was not visible at the level of research he had conducted. It was visible to anyone who looked very carefully at the right filings, but nobody had looked that carefully yet. We discussed the structure of a potential investment. I asked questions. I listened to the answers. I watched Preston Ellis's financial advisors, who were good at their jobs and asking exactly the right questions. And I watched Matthew respond to those questions with the patience and precision that made him invaluable. At the end of the meeting, Preston Ellis said, "We'd like to continue this conversation. Can we schedule a formal presentation?" I said yes. I said the presentation would be to the full partnership committee, if that was acceptable. He said that was unusual for a preliminary conversation. I said I understood, but given the scope of what I was proposing, I thought it would be more efficient to address the partnership committee directly, and I said, because I wanted to be transparent about my motivations in a way that left no room for subsequent surprise. I was a law student in the early part of my career. I understand the culture of large law firms. I'd like the people who are going to be making this decision to be in the room. He looked at me for a moment. Not a suspicious look, a thoughtful look. The look of someone recalibrating. That's an unusual request, he said again. I know, I said. But I think it will make the conversation go better. He agreed. The partnership committee meeting was scheduled for 6 weeks later. 41 partners of Mitchell, Grant, and Harper gathered in the firm's main conference room, a room with windows that overlooked the East River, a room with the particular quality of serious commercial real estate that says, "Things of consequence happen here." I arrived early. I set up the presentation materials myself, a 40-page deck that Matthew and I had built over 3 weeks, covering the financial analysis, the proposed structure, the terms, the timeline. I checked the room, I checked the technology, I found the chair at the head of the table that would allow me the best sightline to all 41 partners, and I placed my notebook, the current one, a black leather cover, well worn, on the table next to the laptop. I want to tell you what it felt like to stand in that room before anyone else arrived. I had been in rooms like this throughout my career, high-floor conference rooms in major buildings with the particular combination of quality materials and impersonal design that signals serious commercial purpose. I had stopped being intimidated by them sometime in year 9, when I had been in enough of them to understand that they were just rooms. The quality of the furniture did not improve the quality of the thinking that happened in them, and the people who occupied them regularly were not more capable than the people who occupied ordinary rooms. They were, in some cases, considerably less capable, because the selection process for occupying a room like this is not entirely a process of ability, and I had known this from the first year of law school. But standing there alone, 15 minutes before anyone else arrived, I noticed that I was feeling something, not nervousness. I had done the preparation. The analysis was solid. I knew every number in the deck. I had anticipated every question that a serious financial mind might ask, and I had the answers ready. The legal structure was correct. The proposed terms were fair. Genuinely fair, not favorable to me fair, because I wanted a transaction that would work, not a transaction that would be resented. What I was feeling was something closer to a kind of stillness, the specific stillness that comes at the end of a very long process of motion. I had been moving, figuratively, constantly, for 15 years, and in approximately 15 minutes I would walk into the room that the motion had been building toward, and I would do the thing I had been building toward, and then the long preparation would be complete, and what came after it would be a different thing entirely. I thought about my mother. I thought about the navy blue dress she had worn to my graduation. I thought about the kitchen table where I had sat at 3 a.m, surrounded by legal pads, and made the decision to be patient. I thought about the notebook, the original one, not the current one on the table in front of me, the first notebook, the one I had started in April of my final year, in a law school building where I was cleaning offices. I had filled the first 20 pages in my neatest handwriting, because I had understood even then that the information needed to be legible, not just captured. That care, the care of someone who is thinking about the future use of what they're recording, not just the present moment of recording it. That was the first act of patience. 15 years of patience, ending in this room. People came in over about 15 minutes. I watched them enter. I knew some of them by name. From my research, I knew others by reputation. I recognized Preston Ellis and the financial advisors from the preliminary meeting. I recognized Gregory Harper, who was heavier than he had been in law school, and who sat down near the middle of the table without looking at me. I recognized Harrison Grant, who was looking at his phone as he came in, and who took a seat near the window. I recognized Kyle Prescott last. He came in with the particular ease of someone who considers this room his natural environment. Slightly late, as though to communicate that his schedule is full, acknowledging several people as he walked to his seat with the practiced warmth of a man who has spent 15 years being strategically charming. He sat down. He looked at me. He looked the way people look when they see something they don't have a file for. A brief, unguarded moment of computation, the brain running without a result. I watched his expression pass through unfamiliarity into something like the edge of recognition, and then back into the controlled neutrality of the professional setting. I could see, in that moment, that he didn't quite place me. 15 years changes a face. I was no longer 23 years old in a Goodwill suit. I was 38, and I had the kind of presence that comes not from clothing or posture, but from being certain, for the first time in a very long time, that I was in the right room. Preston Ellis called the meeting to order. I stood up. I don't want to overstate the drama of what happened. What happened was not a film. There was no moment of gasping revelation, no music swelling, no one collapsing in their chair. What happened was much quieter than that, and much more permanent. I presented the financial analysis. I presented the proposed structure. I answered questions from the partners. Good questions, serious questions, the kind that told me these were, whatever else, competent people who understood their own institution, answered all of them clearly and without hedging. Then, at the end of the formal presentation, I said, "Before we move to the question of next steps, I want to address something that I think the partnership should understand about who they're doing business with." The room settled. "My name is familiar to some people in this room," I said. "I was a student at Alderton Law School approximately 15 years ago. I was a scholarship student. In my final semester, my scholarship was revoked, based on a complaint of academic dishonesty that was fabricated. The fabrication was sophisticated enough to withstand an appeal process that was not, itself, conducted impartially." Kyle Prescott's face had gone very still. "I graduated anyway," I said. "I passed the bar. I built a practice. Over 15 years, the entities associated with Caldwell Group have accumulated a position that now makes me the most logical source of the capital your firm needs. That is not a coincidence. It is the result of a very long period of patience." I opened my laptop. I played a recording. It was not the full conversation I had overheard that night in the law school building. It was the portion relevant to the fabrication of the document used to support the scholarship complaint. The audio quality was not perfect. I had recorded it on a small digital recorder that I had begun carrying in my shirt pocket during my cleaning shifts, about 2 weeks after I started to understand what was happening. But the voices were clear enough. Kyle's voice was clear enough. I let it play for 45 seconds. Then I stopped it. "I have 14 additional pages of documented observations from the same period," I said. "Several of them involve matters that, if examined by the appropriate professional conduct authorities, would be significant not just to individual careers, but to this firm's standing and to certain judicial proceedings. I am not providing this information to those authorities, because that is not what I am here to do. I am here to do a transaction. The transaction I am proposing is financially sound. You have the analysis in front of you, and your people have had 3 weeks to review it. I am prepared to proceed on the terms stated." The room was completely silent. "What I am telling you," I said, "is that you understand now, completely, who you are doing business with. There will be no surprises. I have no interest in litigation or in regulatory complaints. I have an interest in a commercially sensible transaction and in the operation of a well-run law firm. That is all." I sat down. Preston Ellis looked at Kyle Prescott. Kyle Prescott was looking at the table. Gregory Harper was looking at his hands. Harrison Grant was looking at me, and the look on his face was the most complex expression I had seen in a very long time. Something between recognition and calculation, and a kind of sick understanding. The transaction took 4 months to finalize. It was commercially structured exactly as I had proposed. My entities acquired controlling interest in Mitchell, Grant, and Harper through a convertible arrangement that gave them management rights over the firm's strategic direction. This was disclosed publicly, in the standard way that these things are disclosed, and it generated a moderate amount of attention in the legal press. Interest in who the Caldwell Group was, where the capital had come from, what the investment thesis was. My name was now public, in a way it had not been before. A journalist at a legal industry publication, a careful, patient woman named Claire Bennett, pieced together enough of the story to publish a profile. She found the Alderton connection. She found the scholarship revocation. She did not find the notebook because I had not told her about it, but she found enough to write a story that was, in its quiet way, damning to the people involved. Kyle Prescott resigned from the firm 4 weeks after the transaction closed. He did so in a letter that cited personal reasons, and that was, in the language of these letters, completely opaque about the actual reasons. The professional conduct inquiry that had been quietly developing into Judge Prescott's judicial relationships accelerated after the transaction, in part because the change in the firm's ownership led to a review of certain historical matters that the previous management had kept internal. I did not initiate this review. I did not need to. I had created the conditions under which it became inevitable. Gregory Harper remained at the firm. I let him remain at the firm because he was an adequate attorney, and because replacing him would have required attention I didn't want to spend, and because his presence there, working at a firm I now controlled, was its own kind of consequence. Harrison Grant left. He found a position at a smaller firm in a smaller city. He did not call me. Lauren Mitchell, my commercial real estate broker from the early years, who had found me the office above the dry cleaner, came to the closing dinner. Not as a professional participant. I invited her because she had helped me when helping me required taking a chance on someone with no track record, and I had not forgotten that. She sat next to Matthew at dinner and spent most of the evening talking to him about real estate valuations, and I sat at the end of the table and watched the people around me, and felt something that I identified after a moment as the specific exhaustion of a project that is complete. Not satisfaction, not joy, exhaustion. The particular tiredness that comes when the thing you have been holding in your mind for a very long time finally releases. My mother called the next morning. She had read the article that Claire Bennett had written. She was quiet for a moment after I answered, and then she said, "Did you do what you set out to do?" I thought about that question. "Yes," I said. She was quiet. Again, then, "Are you happy?" And I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "That's honest." And then, "Come home for Thanksgiving." 6 months after he resigned from Mitchell, Grant, and Harper, Kyle Prescott called my office. My assistant, a young man named Owen Bennett, who was quiet and meticulous, and who had developed an ability to assess people that I trusted completely, told me Kyle had called and left a message and was requesting a meeting. I sat with that information for 24 hours. The next day, I told Owen to let Kyle know that I was available for a 15-minute call the following Tuesday at 2 p.m. The call came through on time. "I will give Kyle Prescott this." He was punctual. "I'd like to meet," he said. "I think there are things we should discuss." "There aren't," I said. A pause. "I want to explain." "You don't need to explain anything to me," I said. "I understand everything that happened. I understood it 15 years ago. I don't need an explanation, and I'm not interested in one." "Then what?" He stopped himself. Then, "Is there anything I can do?" I thought about this question. I thought about what it would mean to answer it honestly, about how many different kinds of answers were available to me, and I thought about which answer was true. "No," I said, "there's nothing you can do." "I made a mistake," he said. "I want you to know I understand that." "I'm sure you do," I said. And then I said, "Kyle, you're calling because you want something, not because you want to explain or apologize. Those are the forms the call has taken, but they're not what you're actually asking for. What you're actually asking for is some kind of reconciliation that would allow you to feel better about what you did, or some kind of opportunity that would allow you to rebuild what you've lost. I'm not able to provide either of those things. Not because I'm not angry, but because we're not in a relationship where those things are possible." A long silence. "I'd like to wish you well," I said. "That's genuine. I would like for you to have a good life. I just won't be part of it." I hung up. Owen put his head in the door a moment later and asked if I wanted my 3 o'clock moved up. "Yes," I said, "and hold my calls for a while." I sat in my office and looked at the city below me and tried to locate what I was feeling, and what I found was not triumph. What I found was a kind of finality, the sense that a door had closed, and that on the other side of it was a very long chapter of my life, and that the chapter was done. I need to tell you about the cost. I committed at the beginning of this to telling the truth, and the truth includes the parts that don't serve the narrative of the triumphant return. The person I became in order to do what I did, the patient observer, the meticulous recorder, the strategically invisible accumulator of leverage, is not a person who is easy to be in ordinary life. The skills that allowed me to survive Alderton and build the Caldwell Group are skills that operate against genuine human connection. I notice things about people. I notice inconsistencies in their stated motivations. I notice the gap between what people say and what they do. And I have a trained instinct to categorize and file that gap against some future need. I am, in social situations, always partly somewhere else, always partly in the observation mode that I developed at age 23 cleaning office buildings at midnight. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like in practice, because abstractions are easy to dismiss. A few years ago, year 12 of the firm, I was at a dinner, a professional dinner organized by a financial industry association, where the people around the table were people I knew professionally, and some of whom I considered as close to friends as I allowed. There was good food and good wine, and the conversation was interesting, genuinely interesting, about infrastructure investment and regulatory trends. Topics I find substantively engaging, and I was there, at the table, contributing to the conversation. But I was also, and I noticed this clearly in the moment, which is itself a strange experience, I was also cataloging. I was tracking who said what, and in what order, and with what implied alliance to whose position. I was noting the moment when one person shifted the conversation away from a topic that had been making him uncomfortable. I was noting the way a woman across the table from me adjusted her narrative about a business decision she'd made, subtly but measurably, based on who was in the room. I was doing this automatically, without choosing to do it. The way a musician hears a chord and knows whether it resolves, whether I want to or not. When I got home that night, I sat in my apartment, and I thought about what it meant that I had been at a pleasant dinner with people I liked, and what I had primarily been doing was recording, filing, assessing for future use. This is what I mean when I say the cost is real. This is not compatible with trust, and trust is what relationships require. I have professional relationships that I value, and that are as close to friendship as I have allowed in 15 years. Matthew Turner, who has been with me since the beginning, is one of them. Lauren Mitchell, who found me the office above the dry cleaner, is another. Fiona Grant, who has been one of my firm's best attorneys for 9 years, is a third. But I have never had a romantic relationship that lasted longer than 8 months. And every time it ended, the real reason, not the one that got stated out loud, was the same. I was not fully there. Some part of me was always at a remove, always observing, always calculating. The women I dated were not wrong to notice this. They were correct. It is a real absence. I think about my mother's question sometimes. Are you happy? Here is what I can say with accuracy. I am not unhappy. I am engaged. I find my work genuinely interesting. I am financially secure in a way that I never could have imagined at 23, eating rice and beans in a converted storage room. I have built something real and substantial, and I built it myself from nothing, without shortcuts, without anyone opening a door for me. But there is a quality to my days that I can only describe as muffled, like wearing headphones that aren't quite off. The world comes through, but at a slight remove. I am present and I function well and I do my work, but there is something underneath the functioning that is quieter than I expected it to be. I think this is what happens when you spend 15 years in the patient accumulation of a single purpose. The purpose fills you, and when the purpose is complete, the space it occupied doesn't immediately fill with something else. It remains there, the shape of the thing that was, waiting to become the shape of whatever comes next. I don't know yet what comes next. I've allowed myself not to know, for now. My therapist, a patient woman named Elise Harper, who I have been seeing for 3 years and who does not take any nonsense from me, which is the quality I value most in her, says that not knowing is not the same as being lost. She says that I spent 15 years learning how to find things, and that I will eventually find this too. I believe her. Most days I believe her. Gregory Harper has continued to practice law. He is, as far as I can determine, a more careful person than he was at 22. More careful about what he says and to whom. More careful about the appearance of his conduct. This may be character development, or it may simply be the pragmatic adaptation of someone who understands more clearly now where the lines are. I don't know which it is. I don't think it matters much, because either way he's less harmful than he was. Harrison Grant landed at a smaller firm, and from what I can see, is competent and productive in an environment that suits him better than Mitchell, Grant, and Harper's version of excellence did. He never reached out to me. This tells me something about him, either pride or the specific kind of shame that comes from knowing in detail what you participated in. I don't particularly care which. Kyle Prescott has been in private legal consulting for the past 2 years. His father's retirement, and the professional conduct inquiry that followed, removed the infrastructure of influence that his career had been built on. He is not impoverished. He made real money over 15 years as a partner, but he is no longer ascending, and in the world he grew up in, that is its own kind of exile. Judge Prescott retired under circumstances that were described in the legal press as voluntary. The professional conduct inquiry concluded with findings that were not criminal, but that were significant and that were made public. The judge's name, which had been a door-opening word in certain legal circles for 30 years, became a liability. These consequences were not entirely of my making. I created conditions. Conditions have consequences. The consequences belong to the people who created the underlying problems, not to me. That's what I tell myself, and I believe it is substantially accurate, and I notice that I am very careful about believing it, which is its own kind of information. In the summer following the transaction, I did something I had been thinking about for a while. I took the notebook, not just the law school one, but all of them. 14 years of careful observations, 38 notebooks in total, and I read through them. It took 3 weeks, reading in the evenings after work. It was, in a way, a biography I hadn't realized I was writing. Every night shift, every overheard conversation, every document, every date and name and detail, it was the cartography of everything that had happened to me and everything I had done in response. I kept the notebooks that contained information relevant to matters still under examination. Those I have given to legal counsel, with instructions about their use. The rest, the majority, I burned. Not dramatically, not ceremonially. I had a fireplace in my apartment, and I burned them one evening while I was watching something on television, feeding pages into the fire without watching them go. I understand that some people will find this choice regrettable, that the notebooks might have had other uses, might have served justice in additional ways, might have been preserved as documentation of something worth documenting. I understand that argument. But here is the thing about carrying detailed evidence of the worst things people have done. It is heavy. It is a weight that you get used to carrying, the way you get used to any chronic thing, but which does not get lighter. And I had been carrying it for 15 years, and I was done. I am done being the person who keeps the record. I have been that person, and it was necessary, and I would not change it, but I am finished with it. I sit in my office on a Tuesday evening. Most evenings I'm here late, which is a habit I seem to be unable to break, and I look at the city below. My mother is coming to visit next week. She's 71 now, and still sharp, and still direct, and still asks me what I'm reading. I have a list ready for her. Matthew has proposed expanding the firm's investment strategy in a direction I find genuinely interesting. Infrastructure projects in mid-sized markets that are underserved by conventional capital. I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks, and I believe he's right. We're meeting about it Thursday. Fiona and her team are in the middle of a complex matter that she thinks will establish a precedent worth establishing. She may be right. I'm watching it closely. These are the things that occupy my days. Real things. Built things. Things that will continue after me. I received an email last month from Rachel Ellis, Professor Rachel Ellis from Alderton Law School, who noted my excellence in class all those years ago, and who had recommended me for the moot court competition, and who had, I believed, understood something of what happened to me, even if she couldn't prove it. She had read the article about the Mitchell, Grant, and Harper transaction. She wrote to say she was glad to know how things had turned out. I wrote back. A short email. I thanked her for being a teacher who noticed the right things. I didn't say more than that, because there wasn't more than that to say that would have been useful. She replied with one line, I always thought you'd figure it out. I sat with that email for a long time. I'm not entirely sure what she meant by figure it out. I'm not entirely sure I have, in all the ways that matter. The professional life, yes. The financial position, yes. The specific, patient, 15-year project of making the people who treated me as nothing understand that I was not nothing, yes. But the internal life, the quality of days, the question my mother asked me on the phone and that I answered honestly, that I'm still working on. I think I will be working on it for a while. And I think, if I'm being entirely honest with you, which I said at the beginning I would be, I think that's okay. The cost of what I did is real, and I'm not pretending otherwise. The isolation is real. The muffled quality of certain days is real. I traded things I didn't know I was trading for other things that I wanted very badly and that are genuinely valuable. That's the bargain. That's what it actually costs, not in money, but in the texture of a life. I wouldn't tell you it wasn't worth it. I wouldn't tell you it was simple. I would tell you this. They thought I was nothing. They thought that the absence of money and connections and the right last name meant the absence of capacity, that the person in the donated suit, cleaning their offices, writing notes in a small notebook, had no significance to the story they were writing. They were wrong, not because I was secretly exceptional, not because of some hidden quality that would inevitably reveal itself, but because I was paying attention, because I was patient, because I understood from the first day that what I could not buy or inherit or be given, I would have to build. And that building takes time, and time is the one resource that cannot be manipulated by anyone who doesn't control it. I controlled my time. That was the only advantage I ever had. but it turned out to be enough. I always thought it would be enough. It just cost me more than I knew to find out. Stories like this happen more than you think. Someone right now is sitting in silence, building something the people who underestimated them will never see coming. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.